This evening we have a exciting topic for all of us that we've been contemplating around schools, human rights, and the Canadian Charter. Joining us this evening, along with Human Rights and Equity Advisor Pardeep Nagra, we've got Gillian Tuck Kutarna, who will be here to help us with this conversation. I know that we have all been grappling with these issues over the last year and into the year two, and I know that is something that we want to keep top of mind about how we can create spaces in our schools that respects the Charter of Rights, respects human rights, but also creates spaces of belonging, places of safety, places where all feel that they belong. And so that's the challenge and the balance that I'm always trying to achieve as a director of education. And so I hope that that's something that we can do, respecting rights, individual rights, collective rights, but also create spaces in schools and communities where all feel that they belong. And that's my goal and my aim. And I hope that we can get further and closer towards that after our conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our guest, Gillian, to start the conversation this evening.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here this evening and to have this conversation with you. It's an ever-evolving topic. We never completely nail down how we balance competing rights and how we reconcile in the school board's case, the role of the school board, the responsibilities of the school board with the expectations, duties, rights, and responsibilities of families and staff. So you asked me, Curtis, just to give a brief overview at the top to talk about the Charter and the Human Rights Code, because there was other two preeminent pieces of legislation that define the rights and responsibilities of Canadians and Ontarians. So I'll speak first about the Charter, which is part of our Constitution, and the purpose, the scope of the Charter, it's important to point out, is to define the relationship between the individual and the state. And the reason that that is now particularly relevant to school boards is that the Supreme Court has said that the scope of the Charter, which it states explicitly applies to the federal and provincial government, also includes school boards. So school boards are bound by the Charter as of a decision that came out in June 2024, where the Supreme Court explicitly stated all actions of school boards are inherently governmental and therefore subject to Charter scrutiny. So just to give a brief overview of what the Charter says about our rights, it first of all says we all have the right to certain fundamental freedoms, and that includes freedom of conscience and religion, thought, belief, opinion, expression, peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. And the Charter also protects our equality rights, and it says that every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination. And then there's because everything in education is about balance. There's what we call the limitations clause, which says that those rights to fundamental freedoms and to equality are modified, we'll say, by this limitations clause that says that although the Charter guarantees the rights and freedoms as it's set out, those rights and freedoms are subject to reasonable limits prescribed by law in as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So as you can imagine, there's some pretty robust case law around what constitutes a reasonable limit and is demonstrably justified. The other major piece of legislation that we talk about a lot and where there's really robust case law with respect to school boards is the Ontario Human Rights Code, because that piece of legislation has preeminence over all other statutes in Ontario. So the Education Act has to be interpreted in light of the Human Rights Code. And the Human Rights Code, unlike the Charter, isn't limited to the rights of the individual versus the state. It defines its own scope in terms of services, goods, and facilities. So we have 5 social areas that are protected under the Human Rights Code from discrimination: jobs, housing, unions and vocational associations, contracts, and services. And because the school board provides a service, it has to act in all cases subject to the Human Rights Code, which says that every person has a right to equal treatment with respect to services without discrimination on any of the 15 enumerated grounds that are protected under the code. And I think I'll just point out with respect to the Human Rights Code that it most of the consideration of the code is not around direct discrimination. So an easy example of direct discrimination would be, for example, only men can be firefighters. Well, that's discrimination on the basis of sex, and so we would say that's not fair. But what's far more common are incidents of indirect or constructive discrimination, where the criteria that are put in place are such that they effectively discriminate against somebody. So if we said only people who are 6'4" could be firefighters, we would be effectively discriminating against a protected group of protected characteristic. That is, far fewer women are 6'4" than men, and so we could say that's an example of constructive discrimination. Now, what's allowable under the code is if there's a criteria that results in exclusion or restriction of a group on the basis of a protected ground, but it's reasonable and bona fide. So it would be reasonable and bona fide to say that firefighters must reach certain physical fitness requirements, or they have to demonstrate certain capabilities in order to do the job, as long as we define them in terms of what that job demands. And there's a similar kind of analysis that takes place when we consider whether or not a student's been the subject of discrimination, because we'll ask, for example, if they have a disability, the board, if there's been discrimination against them on the basis of disability, we ask, did the board meet its duty to accommodate to the point of undue hardship? And it's a similar kind of analysis where it's a balancing of rights and expectations and responsibilities. And we would look to the code, which says that accommodation to the point of undue hardship takes into account cost and health and safety requirements and outside sources of funding, etc. And we would engage in an analysis of whether or not the accommodation was reasonable based on an individual person's needs. So it's always an individualized analysis when it comes to the Human Rights Code. So that's kind of an overview of those two major pieces of legislation that I hope will provide a useful framework for our discussion tonight.
Thank you, Gillian. And yeah, I think it's important to, especially the distinction you had shared in terms of the charter, in terms of individual and state, and then the Ontario Human Rights Code that goes further and deeper around a number of protected grounds and areas of service. And then also what you talked about, individual with individual or other pieces in terms of competing rights. And then those dimensions of responsibility around accommodation. And then that final threshold of undue hardship, right? And I think those pieces and those concepts are important. And it's interesting when I think about this, when I looked at a number of questions that have come in prior, and I know some people may be sharing some questions live while we're having conversations here. There's been lots of questions around students and students' rights, whether it's creed-based, and how does that manifest within a school setting, a curriculum setting, and learning and expressing. And it's interesting because one of the things I want to speak to you about, Gillian, is this concept within the Supreme Court of Canada decision around this term of cognitive dissonance. And it was interesting because this in the Ontario Human Rights Policy on preventing discrimination based on creed, it says children encounter some cognitive dissonance every day in public school systems as members of a diverse student body. They see their classmates and perhaps also their teachers eating foods at lunch that they themselves are not permitted to eat, whether because of their parents' religious strictures or because of other moral beliefs. They see their classmates wearing clothing with features or brand labels which their parents have forbidden them to wear possibly. And they see their classmates engaging in behavior on the playgrounds that their parents have told them not to engage in. The cognitive dissonance that results from such encounters is simply part of living in a diverse society. It's also part of growing up. Through such encounters and experiences, children come to realize that not all of their values are shared by others. Exposure to some cognitive dissonance is arguably necessary if children are to be taught what tolerance itself involves. And that's from a Supreme Court decision, and it really speaks to what we're speaking about here within the school setting. One of the areas around that cognitive dissonance is the Supreme Court doesn't necessarily define it, right? And so when people are sharing what that cognitive dissonance may look like, we do get individuals and parents and students and even staff that might be talking about words like safe, harm. Where do those play when you're looking at this concept of cognitive dissonance? Because, like I said, there's no pure definition or a scale that it speaks to.
Thanks for the question, and I think Curtis probably has some important things to say about this, but I will just say from a legal perspective that there is a distinction between feeling uncomfortable or feeling unsafe and being unsafe. And so as we try to sift through where how we balance the competing rights of people with different backgrounds and cultural and belief systems, we need to think about that. We would look at both the subjective and the objective measurement of things. So subjective would be how I personally feel, and objective would be probably characterized as would a reasonable person in similar circumstances have that experience. In other words, how much of it is coming from me and how much of it is actually related to my circumstance. I think that there's not only, I think there's the court's pointing to the fact that public schools are a place where there will be a diversity of experiences and backgrounds, and that's part of the educational environment. But one thing that's been consistently clear throughout the court's decisions is that exposure is not the same thing as unequal treatment. So there's a right to raise your children in your own home as you see fit and according to your belief system, but there isn't the same right to impose those values on the other people in the class or the school or the community. So I hope that's a helpful distinction in sorting through where we might land on those kinds of things.
And if I may, the issue of feeling, and I know you try to make the distinction, Gillian. As a director, my position and my stance is not just strictly along legal lines, right? It is also trying to balance. I mean, I always love the words, as you know, of Maya Angelou, that people will never forget how you make them feel. It is that emotional connection, a sense of belonging. How you feel in schools, I think, is important. I understand that might not be legally sort of a demarcation, but I think it's important. We want to create spaces where people feel a sense of belonging, they feel welcome, they feel kindness, they feel that they can, turn to their fellow student for support, in any moment. And so, for me as director, the lines are a little bit challenging in that I understand the legality of feelings versus facts, but I also understand that feelings can and is often important.
I think sometimes where we have to dig a little deeper on that is that is to again make a distinction between the feelings of the child and the feelings of the parent, because typically the questions are brought forward by the parent. And it's actually the child who has the right in school to have, and the child's rights are recognized in the Education Act, and you have obligations defined around those things in the Education Act. But sometimes we have to explore whether or not the objection is coming from the parent's expectation around their values versus the child's actual experience in the school.
Yeah, and so, a little continuation on that aspect, and some of the questions have come in, and I also have fielded a number of the questions in my portfolio. People sometimes question, look, you're a public school system, right? And how about those concepts of secularism, and why should creed, religion, faith have any kind of role? And, so that's another area within school boards when we're looking at this aspect, the difference between, sometimes we've heard of comments of separation of church and state, for lack of a better word, right? We've heard of areas where people are looking to saying, should we leave religion out? per se. And, that fine line between engaging and learning about people of other faiths and of faiths itself. And I know, for example, when sometimes parents speak to me about some of these dilemmas, I represent, not necessarily represent, but identify as part of the Sikh faith. And I do have a student and a child in the Halton District School Board. And my son will have exposure to whether it's through faith-based heritage months or other parts of the curriculum. And I always try to kind of share that we want to teach about religion. It's not necessarily endorsing a religion. Any thoughts and reflections and comments on that?
I'm going to defer to Curtis on that. That sounds like an education-based question.
I mean, we know that, as a school board, we cannot indoctrinate or inculcate any particular religion. We understand that we have students representing a vast array of religious beliefs and practices and adherences, and we try to support and accommodate and be as understanding to all of them as possible. And the challenge, of course, becomes, and Pardeep, you know this well, when days of significance, days that students find and their families find that it is important to them, but it's as a board, how do we respond as a board to each days of significance when there are so many days of significance, and some that might not be well known, others are well known, and the questions that we get asked sometimes is, why do you seem to value some days more than other days? And so that's the challenge for us. But I think part of our responsibility is to be as accommodating as possible. And we try to work with schools and communities to make sure that we are listening to communities and we're accommodating. I think that's the threshold, really.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. Two aspects. One, I think from the learning environment, individuals attend our school system, staff are part of our school system. And so learning about different faiths, it's part of students and students' identity, and it's important that we nurture and foster those aspects of identity. And at the same time, where necessary, as part of the Ontario Human Rights Code, provide accommodations if necessary around creed-based aspects. Gillian, another aspect, special programs. The Ontario Human Rights Code has a provision for special programs. And I know, again, sometimes when we're looking at those aspects of special programs, sometimes there's statements made around, is it reverse discrimination? And why is it allowed for one particular group? Any thoughts on those concepts of special programs in school boards?
No, I think as you identify, the code allows for that and says that doesn't constitute discrimination under the code.
Yeah, and because it's trying to address special programs, are trying to address some systemic and historical disproportionalities that we're trying to address around different aspects of charter protected grounds itself. One of the other areas that's important, and we never truly got to it, although it is within some framework, is if we're looking at the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, there are concepts that don't speak specifically when we're talking about, the charter speaking about the state and the individual. When we're looking at UNDRIP, and it goes a little bit further than some of the layers that we've been talking about with the code and the charter, there's concepts such as inherent and inalienable rights, and any reflection on that aspect when we're looking at concepts of Indigenous rights too, because those are aspects for us as a school board, in addition to Truth and Reconciliations Commissions and calls to action, and some of the work we're doing as a school board, looking at concepts of inalienable rights, inherent rights, sovereignty?
I think those documents provide excellent resources for the school boards, prompting the school board to think about those kinds of things.
Yeah, and just, you know, looking at some of those aspects for us when we're looking at and speaking on this topic, to know that while there is some intersectionality of Indigenous rights, it doesn't necessarily easily be all covered through the concepts of the Ontario Human Rights Code and as well as the Charter. You know, there's another area of questions, and when parents were talking about things that they should be considering when we're looking at human rights, is this whole aspect of social media, and it's not necessarily just for students, I guess. You know, it can apply to any staff member as well. When it comes to human rights, social media, using school property, whether it's their emails and stuff like that, or other communication tools while at school, open, fair game against the code?
Sorry, are you asking about whether staff use them or students?
Well, staff and students, because I know through we've been dealing with a lot of issues around students using different aspects of whether it's their monikers or school emails, and communicating, right, and knowing and wanting to share with parents to know that you know, behavior on those platforms is something that's covered with respect to issues around harassment and bullying and other code areas. Absolutely.
And if we look at the features of the Education Act that address matters for which a student can be disciplined, the scope of those sections of the Education Act would say that if we're looking at something that affects the school environment, then it's something that the school board may have an obligation to address. So if messages are and so it's not so much the platform on which the messaging is shared, it's the content of the messaging and the audience it reaches. Publication is publication, whether you're publishing it in a school newspaper or on a social media account. So those are all things that the school board has to take into account when it's responding to student behavior that's contrary to its own code of conduct. And I think some of those things that you've described go more to the board's code of conduct than they do to the Human Rights Code. Students are not subject to the Human Rights Code. They're not obliged to comply with it. They don't provide a service, but the concepts in the Human Rights Code and the things we embrace about our Charter of Rights and Freedoms are in some ways captured in the microcosm of the school and the classroom, and we see some of those same principles captured in your code of conduct. So that goes to the school environment. And I don't know, Curtis, did you want to comment on those kinds of things?
No, I just was wondering about if you could clarify. You said that students the exact wording that you use, students are not.
Well, I just wanted to clarify that a student could not be charged with the breach of the Human Rights Code because they're not the Board of Education providing a service.
But the board can be.
Certainly, yes.
But not the student.
Correct. Like if it's a student communicating to another student, we wouldn't engage the Human Rights Code. We would look to the board's code of conduct, I think, to ask whether or not that student had conducted themselves in a way in which discipline would be appropriate. But there's but you know, the Halton District School Board has a very comprehensive code of conduct, and I was trying to make the point that many of the same concepts are protected under the code of conduct, really.
Yeah, and for that, we have other aspects. For example, our harmful language protocol, right? That speaks to a number of things. Whether something is said verbally, something is said within a concept of text between students or a WhatsApp chat, and you know, I really want to bring that in because right now, separate from the provincial initiative trying to not have schools, not have phones in classrooms outside of educational needs. a lot of students are using their phones as communication tools, and that they'll still be subject to what you said, different aspects of the student code of conduct, a harmful language protocol, that all those things apply to students, even on those devices, which may be seen as personal in some aspects itself too. Curtis, you opened up. Yeah, sorry, you're going to say something?
I just wanted to make a point there, Pardeep. Students need to understand that, as I think Gillian alluded to, one of the words that we like to use in education is the word nexus, meaning connection to, right? So if their behaviors have a connection or a nexus to the school, then that becomes subject to consequences of the school and school board. Right. And so I think students sometimes don't understand that because you're on your, they would say, well, I'm on my own private time in my own private space doing my own private things. But if it has a nexus to the school has the authority and the obligation, I would argue, to take action. And so students need to be mindful of that your actions, you're always a student of the school and the board, even when you're on your private time. That goes for myself, it goes for staff, it goes for all of us, really.
Yep, and a good example of that, Curtis, would be whether you're standing on the school stage or you're standing in the playground talking to a group of your friends, or you're texting a group of friends. That's just geography. That's just the issue of the platform. It's what you've said and whether or not it affects the school environment of the people you speak to or the people you're speaking about that is the really important element to evaluate. Yeah, I completely agree. That's an important thing for everybody to understand. It's easy to affect the school environment if you're copying everybody in your class.
Yeah, and so, a lot of questions have come up when we're looking at what Curtis had talked about, the challenge and the balance, and looking at charter rights, and that freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and what does that look like, and especially within a school context, and what are some of the limitations attached to that as well, and trying to have that balance, Curtis, as you had mentioned, around supporting rights, and at the same time that challenge and balancing piece around other aspects, and things like the student protests is one of those things right now that we're always hearing from the community on all aspects and on all sides of the issue of around freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, and possibly limiting that aspect, but what would be those reasonable grounds of limitation? Any thoughts and reflections on that big issue?
Yeah. So, for me, I always like to elevate the conversation. And I know, Gillian, you are a lawyer by trade, but, I always like to elevate the conversation beyond just the legalities. Because the legalities mean that the law will hold you accountable, if you breach that in any way. But I often think, because you have a right, here's how I think about it. Because you have a right doesn't always make it the right thing to do. And what I mean by that is, you may have a protected right under the Human Rights Code, under the Charter of Rights, but if that right, impacts others in a way that causes them, to be hurt, causes them harm, causes them, creates a situation in which, they're concerned. Then I think as a human being, from a moral standpoint, I want to, if I were in that situation, I want to evaluate how my exercising of my right impacts others. And so, and I know that's not always everyone's posture or position, right? Others might think, if it's my right, then you have no right to infringe on that, and I can exercise it whenever I want, however I want, within the limitations, as you mentioned, Gillian. However, I often try to take the more compassionate, caring approach, even when exercising my own right. So that's something I always ask others to reflect on. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Gillian.
I think that's a really important way to think about it. And it's, I would say that when we analyze legal rights and responsibilities, we're just taking it to a more base level, which is to say, do you have the right to exercise your right of freedom of expression on a school ground in a manner that will disrupt the learning of the other students and potentially impact staff and how they feel about their workplace. And so it's a balancing, as we've been saying with all these issues, a balancing of that right. And I think it is a reasonable limit to place upon somebody's freedom of expression that they don't exercise it in a schoolyard during school hours. And in reaching that conclusion, I rely in part on the Occupational Health and Safety Act that says that the school board has an obligation to provide staff with a safe workplace. Large assemblies of people don't always result in safety, and they certainly don't always result in everybody feeling safe. They're hard to control. You don't know if it's going to be a group of 10 or a group of several hundred people, and there's a big difference to how that impacts the other people on the property. And I think that students can exercise their freedom of expression in other locations. So it's not that they can't express themselves, it's just that they can't express themselves during school hours on school property. So I think, in my view, that is a justifiable limit to the right to freedom of expression. At the end of the day, it comes down to a principal's discernment about how they're going to ensure that they meet their obligation to provide a safe working and learning space, and that can be a balancing act. So back to your point, then, I guess at the end, Curtis, is that we ask people to recognize that it's not as simple as just saying that you have the right. There's a lot of other competing rights at stake.
Yeah, and Jill, as part of our earlier conversation when we talked about no hierarchy of rights or no right is absolute, related to this principle that no right is absolute, every right is inherently limited by the rights and freedoms of others, right? And I think, Curtis, that's where you were kind of starting to explore that concept of saying, where does that sit and where does it land and how does it land itself too? And so then there's this charter principle of so-called reconciliation that fully respects the importance sometimes of both sets of rights so that each is realized to the greatest extent possible, right? And so that's another aspect that's at play sometimes for us to think about. How do we do that balance within the concept of that charter principle of reconciliation?
Well, and it's not all that different from accommodating, for example, under accommodating a disability under the Human Rights Code. It's not always the Human Rights Tribunal has been clear that you don't have the right to perfection in your accommodation. You have the right to what's reasonable. And so we're always in that zone of balancing and trying to work things out in a way that's fair and as equitable as we can make them. But we don't typically get the perfect remedy that as defined by us. That's not what the law protects.
And so, I think it's reasonable, to ask, students, while you're exercising your right, we're going to ask that you not, disrupt the learning of others. I think that's a reasonable expectation. And so, I know that there are those who disagree with that position, but as director, I believe that's a reasonable position. I do believe that students should primarily come to school, have a safe environment, feel a sense of belonging, and focus on their learning. And I think those should be protected in the same way that we protect the charter right and the human rights of all. I think we should protect the learning environment, protect the safety and well-being of students, and focus on learning and achievement. I think that's a reasonable thing for a school and a school board to have at the center of their environment.
And we've discussed this before, Curtis. There's a legal definition to what that learning is supposed to encompass, and that's the curriculum as defined by the Ministry of Education. So a person might broadly say, well, isn't it good learning? Aren't you learning about civil disobedience if you say, I'm going to go have my protest anyway? And that's actually not what the Board of Education gets funded to deliver. That's not the curriculum that the Board of Education is responsible for. That may be a really important part of someone's growing up, an important part of their learning and great life experience, but it's not what the Board of Education delivers. And so I would say quite strongly that whatever lessons they might get from exploring their own interest in expressing themselves in that way, it's not part of the daily learning that the Board of Education has to deliver.
Yeah, and so we Gillian, you touched upon an area where those are sometimes comments and statements that get asked, especially because one aspect there are aspects. There's the grade 10 curriculum piece from the ministry, civics and act, right? The Canadian civics course that students learn about, and they are learning about a lot of different issues globally as well. There's the new curriculum within, I believe, the grade 6 panel around Holocaust studies. Students will learn about controversial and sensitive issues and topics and be exposed to as part of critical thinking, global citizenship. So there's a lot of different dimensions for which a lot of the areas and aspects that we're talking about within human rights that are part of the curriculum. And we just had a chance to speak to some system leaders this morning. And, when we're looking at sharing out some things to consider, we also recognize too that some of the global conflicts that are going on right now are really taking a toll on many communities that we serve in Halton, on families, on individuals, on students as well. And it's important also as a board to recognize that impact and also create space with it for student voice. Right, within curriculum, within programming, within discussions. Not always easy, but important nevertheless. Because yes, Gillian, you talked about the concept of civil disobedience, for lack of a better word, in terms of one manifestation piece itself as an act or an expression, and other ones can be discussion, debate, and discourse, and it comes back to that concept of cognitive dissonance, right? That how do you create those spaces for students to have voice and be able to sit in difference as well, and so that's an important piece. Curtis, any other thoughts in terms of pieces that you want to share out to either families, communities, because I know. For a number of other issues as well, we have been open as a board to listening to and meeting with different community groups. We had, as part of our own directors panel series last year, the Interfaith Council as well. So there's many aspects. Human rights is broad within a school setting. We talked about a lot of the protected grounds. We talked about disability. We talked about race and creed and sex and gender expression and sexual orientation. And so there's many, many different aspects for which at any given time and on any given day, we have enormous responsibility as a school board to both uphold and balance.
Yeah, no, and that is the challenge, Pardeep. As you know, my particular style of leadership is to listen to everyone, and I try to be as fair as possible. Providing space to listen to all sides, and I know that in doing so, I always sort of try to straddle the line of listening to all, and it never makes anyone completely happy, if I'm being honest. But it's I do so deliberately, and I do so genuinely, trying to understand and seeking to understand. And what I can tell you is that if we talk about even the current, crisis in the Middle East, Israeli, Jewish, Palestinian, Muslim, Christian, and others who are impacted, and they're all impacted. And so I hear from all of them. And so, while you might listen to, a particular narrative in your community, I hear from all communities on and how they're being impacted. And I can tell you the impact is real on everyone. And so my job then is to try to steer our board in a place where we can be kind, we can be compassionate, we can be understanding, but we can also try to protect the learning environment. And so that's where I find myself, in that intersection of being kind, compassionate, and caring and understanding to all, but protecting the learning environment for all. And that's the rub, because I think, very rarely is everyone ever happy with that position.
Yeah, and probably more than anybody in the board, you probably get a lot of comments, and it's not necessarily the direction we want people to necessarily take, because I know some of the questions that have come in. Individuals sometimes want to know, what kind of process is there if a student is experiencing or a staff member is experiencing discrimination, and they're two different areas per se, but some might flow the same way. But for example, if it's student based in a school, we always think that, and you were talking about early some other concept of nexus, but in this concept, it would be to first speak to the teacher. The teacher can then, if necessary, bring it up with school leadership. And then again, if school leadership needs to bring it up, they can bring it up with system leaders and the superintendents. And again, if it needs to go further, it can go up into the director's and associate director's office itself. And so those are some areas that we want people to know, to really start locally of where possibly an incident might have happened and who to speak to first and foremost. Also, people have asked, and when we're talking about the staffing aspect itself, if it's happening in a school environment, and you're a staff member, you're a teacher, to speak to the school leadership piece itself. If it's in a department, speak to a manager or a general manager. And then we do have human resources as well, as points of contact. And then we also have other support areas and offices, including my office, the human rights as a human rights and equity advisor. And so we want people to know that we're open to listening to concerns. We're here and we want to support not only upholding human rights, but also advancing human rights. And I know a lot of our discussion right now was really looking at some of the legalities and the balancing aspect itself too. But we know that and I think, Gillian, you talked about some frameworks of, something on the surface might have one intention and the impact might come out another way. And I know over the years being in school boards for a long time, whether it's looking at suspensions, right, and how where suspensions carrying out and where they're disproportionately impacting students from different demographic backgrounds, where they're mitigating factors, and looking at all those aspects as well. That are important, so we also look at those areas when it comes to human rights too. That it's not necessarily just in some of the areas we've spoken about, but when we look at us as a system and how we're performing and how we're engaging, and what's the impact of our policies, our procedures, and way of practice as a school board, and to make sure that we don't have negative impacts on different aspects of our school community, including students and staff. And so those are other areas that we are always engaging as a school system when it comes to these aspects of human rights.
Yeah, always a challenge and a balancing act. I think at the end of the day, I would want our community to know that the leadership of the Halton District School Board, whether it be our trustees, our senior staff, our school leaders, our staff, that we are, we're committed to making sure that we are being kind, compassionate, and caring and focused on learning. And so that's where I always want to bring the conversation back to. Of course, we're supporting human rights. Of course, we're adhering to the Charter of Rights. But as I said earlier, you always want to make sure that you are, there's some reasonability and reasonableness within how you enact your right to these, whether it be a charter right or a human right, that you are being mindful of others and the impact on others. And so that's all I ask, that our students and our staff be mindful of the impact of your action on others, right? So let's try to keep our school communities one that is kind, caring, and compassionate while we learn. That's all.
Sure. And Gillian, is there any other emerging issues within human rights or the charter for school boards that we should be mindful of, or our community should be mindful of when we're looking at these aspects?
I'm reluctant to add anything to what Curtis just said. That was a really nice way to wrap up and to bring us back to first principles, which is at the end of the day, I'm not sure it is always needs or should be a question of law. It should be what's the right thing to do and what kind of school do you want your children to go to, and you got to be a part of that of that community that you want to help build. So I thought Curtis did a great job of summarizing what it's really all about, because when you have a right protected by a law, then you look for how you're going to enforce that right and what's your remedy. And those are all legal inquiries. But Curtis is talking about building schools where you don't need to ask those questions.
Yeah, no, and I think that's an important message. It might be a great message for us to almost wrap up with. And so just in closing, Curtis, probably if anything, if you want to just share some last few words, and then I'll just close it up and thank Gillian for her thoughts and comments as well.
Thanks, Pardeep. And I want to thank the audience for joining us this evening on this important topic of schools, human rights, and the Charter of Rights. I would say, as I've said, throughout this evening and conversation, that, for me, it's about elevating the conversation beyond the legalities into a space where we are being kind, caring, compassionate, and in an environment and a community that care for each other, regardless of our identity and because of our identity. I think at the end of the day, we serve many different identities in our school. There can be competing rights, there can be competing beliefs, and we can still harmoniously live together in a community, even believe in different things. And so it's how do we get to a place where we are being kind and caring and compassionate to each other, even when we don't believe the same things. And we don't need to believe the same things. Our beliefs are protected, and our beliefs, right? That's part of the conversation that we're having. Our beliefs are protected, but at the same time, leave space for caring about your fellow human being, right? Leave space in your own belief system to know that you may have a right, but if your right is causing harm, then you may want to think about that on a human and moral and ethical level. And that's different from a legal lens. And so that's what I'm asking parents and students and staff to think about.
Great. And, I'm reminded of a great philosopher that many people might be familiar with, Rumi, and he has a quote. He goes, beyond good and bad, rights and wrongs, there's a field and I'll meet you there. Right. And that's really our goal, our journey that you said in terms of what kind of climate in schools and classrooms we're trying to create. And it's that field where you mentioned a lot of the principles that are important there. Gillian, I'm going to so-called share out something that we didn't at the beginning, because I do want to thank you for many different roles that you played. And a lot of our viewers might or might not be aware that you even served the Halton District School Board as a trustee and chair, and so you have and continue to provide service in so many different ways to the Halton District School Board and the Halton community. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you for all the service and leadership that you provide. You're always available to us. And I think, again, today we're discussing, I think you're going to be working with our trustees in an upcoming PD as well. And so you're never too far away from us all the time. And we really always really appreciate your insight and your thoughts and your support. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me tonight. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you. And so once again, as Director Ennis had said, we thank everybody who's had a chance to share this time with us tonight. This is something that is recorded and will be put up. If you want to share this Director's Panel series with anybody else, or if you want to take a look at some of our previous ones as well. I think they touch upon some of the aspects that we talked about of how do we create a more inclusive and welcoming school community. That's our goal, and we look forward to continuing to play an important role in helping students, family, community, and staff really value the Halton District School Board as an exemplar when it comes to human rights and education and educational outcomes. So thank you very much, and we look forward to you and tune into our next Director's Panel series in the new year. Thank you.
Thank you, and have a good night.